Hello, Fairlawn Ambulance Corps, and welcome back to episode 4 of these trainings. Again, my name is Jonathan Barr, and this time I decided to do something a little bit different. So previously we've been talking about vital signs, we've been talking about patient assessment and other clinical topics. This time, since I was recently put into a new position as Director of Disaster Preparedness, I thought I would do something in the vein of disaster and mass casualty management. So we're going to do a brief introduction to NIMS and ICS, which is something you should all be familiar with. So take a few minutes here to read my disclaimer. Okay, so what are we going to talk about today? First, I'm going to give you a brief overview of the history of NIMS and ICS. We'll talk about the NIMS framework, NIMS management characteristics, and then in particular, we'll focus on the command and control element, which includes the ICS system. And then I'll tell you a little bit of an example of how you might apply this to a real-world incident. Now, all of you should take ICS 100 and NIMS 700 as a minimum, and that's freely available on the FEMA website. What I'm going to go over in this talk is not comprehensive. It doesn't substitute for the formal training. So you should get online and take that as soon as you're able if you haven't done so already. So first, let's talk about the history of NIMS and ICS. So this began really back in 1970, where there were devastating wildfires going on in California. It was causing loss of damage. It was causing loss of life. And there were a lot of problems with communication and coordination among the emergency responders, and something needed to be done about it. So 3 years later, in '73, the FireScope technical team started to develop what would become known as ICS as a command and control element. And in 1980, it was used to battle wildfires. And in the 80s, it started to become more widely adopted. And not only that, it was realized that the principles of ICS, which is the Incident Command System, apply to any incident type, not just fires. And so that was important. Also, what was important at this time is each region had sort of grown their own system, and so there were efforts made to kind of blend them into one standardized thing. Notice how we started with ICS prior to NIMS, because this is how it developed historically. In the 90s, that consolidation continued with the National Fire Service to kind of create this into one nationwide system to try to eliminate the differences regionally to improve communication and coordination among different agencies in different regions. In 1993, that first document was developed to make ICS usable anywhere, and it's added to the National Fire Curriculum. And then here's where NIMS comes in. So NIMS stands for the National Incident Management System, and in 2004, post 9/11, under Homeland Security Presidential Directive Number 5, President Bush ordered the development of a national incident management system to have a consistent nationwide response. And the important thing about NIMS is supposed to be usable regardless of the size, cause, or complexity of the incident. So it had to be kind of an all hazards approach. Not only that, it was required that this system of NIMS be adopted for federal preparedness funding. So that kind of basically made it such that everyone needed to do this. And so NIMS was born, and ICS was folded into NIMS under the command and coordination component. Sometimes in common parlance, you'll hear people talk about NIMS and ICS interchangeably. It's important to understand that ICS is nestled within NIMS. So what's the NIMS framework? So NIMS is a comprehensive nationwide systematic approach to incident management. That's just the basic definition. You should know that it's comprehensive, nationwide, systematic. It's all threats, all hazards across all the areas of prevention, protection, mitigation, response, and recovery. The NIMS framework has 3 main components, which are resource management, command and coordination, and that's where ICS comes in, and information management. The other really important thing that you should know is that NIMS is scalable. So you can use it of any incident of any side, from day-to-day to the mass casualty. And I'm going to say that again, it can be used for the day-to-day to the mass casualty. And I encourage you to use the principles of NIMS daily on your routine calls, because then it's more familiar to you when you get to the big one or to the mass casualty. So this is what that looks like in graphical form. Okay, so you have the three elements of the NIMS framework: resource management, command and coordination, communication and information management, and then nestled under the command and coordination is ICS, which is we'll get into more in a little bit. So in that first part of resource management, there's a lot in there, but one of the important things of it is the resource management cycle. And basically, the key thing that I want you to get out of this is that it's a cycle. So during an incident, you have to continually identify requirements, order to acquire new things, mobilize, track, demobilize, reimburse, and restock. And then as the incident changes, you have to re-identify the resources you need and do the whole thing over again. It's constantly changing throughout the incident as the incident grows or contracts. So if the incident's getting worse, you need to get more resources. If the incident's calming down, you can demobilize resources. Okay? The other thing I want to point out on this slide is that there are strategies and tactics here. Some of you might not know the differences or might use them interchangeably, but strategy is a broader, more overarching. Tactic is like on the ground, how we're going to do it, you know, what the boots on the ground are doing. The overall strategy is a bigger picture. So think big picture, more focused. That's at least just a basic kind of understanding of the differences between the two. So you could have a grand strategy for an incident to accomplish certain objectives, and then the tactics are how you're actually going to do that in a more detailed, local, technical way. Okay. Now, what about that command and coordination arm? Because that's the arm that as frontline EMS providers, we're often most likely to be involved in. So ICS, the key thing about ICS that I want you to get from this slide is that it's used by the local personnel to manage the incident. Now, in a big enough incident, there may need to be opened up an emergency operations center, which may not be on the scene, okay, to support the incident personnel. And also on a big incident, you might need a joint information center to ensure coordinated, accurate public messaging. And I can speak on real incidents. The public messaging is sometimes very difficult to communicate accurately. And then the last part of the NIMS framework was information management. Basically, it's telling us that communications need to have all these characteristics. Okay, so you want it to be reliable, resilient, interoperable, scalable, portable, and secure. And for most of us, this is going to involve radios, especially those Motorola radios, which you can basically run over with the ambulance and they still work. So you really want a good set of sturdy radios that you can use, okay, for these communications. Now, there are other communications that could be used, you know. More and more cell phones are getting used, but by and large, radios still remain the mainstay of this. But whatever communication strategy you use, it should try to have as many of these characteristics as possible. Let's move on to part 3, NIMS management characteristics. So there are 14 NIMS management characteristics. I'm just going to highlight a few of them that are important, I think, for you guys to understand at a very basic level. One is incident action plans. And this is important because when you're having incidents, you're going to make an IAP or incident action plan. In fact, at the 4th of July, fireworks, or Memorial Day, these are created by the ambulance corps, and you'll follow part of an incident action plan. So this is something that you'll do. And using NIMS management characteristics on events like that is good practice for a real mass casualty. The other key NIMS management characteristic that I want you to be aware of is manageable span of control. That means that basically a supervisor can only manage so many subordinates at any given time. If you have too many subordinates, it just gets too confusing. You can't keep track of everyone. And so there's limits that NIMS sets. In an ideal situation, the ideal span of control is 1 supervisor to 5 subordinates. The absolute max is 7. And beyond 7, it's too unwieldy and you can't put all your attention and keep track of everyone. So if the span of control is getting too unwieldy, you need to create subdivisions and subleaders to help offload that. And we'll see how that works in a little bit. Another important NIMS management characteristic is common terminology. You want everyone speaking the same language. You want basically everyone to understand what you're talking about. You don't want to use slang. So for example, bus is sometimes slang for ambulance, but if you call for buses, you might just get New Jersey Transit. You might not get actual ambulances. So you have to understand the key point here is just to use plain English and avoid abbreviations and other confusing terms, including things like 10 codes. So now let's dive into the command and control element, or the incident command system, which is what oftentimes frontline providers are most involved in these incidents. So remember that ICS is a key component of the command and coordination aspect of NIMS. It's a standardized on-scene all hazard incident management concept. That's why it's so important to frontline providers, because this is what you're using on scene to manage the situation. Okay? And ICS, as I told you about the history, it's been around almost 40 years now. So it's pretty well established. Now, most of you have seen a tree that looks something like this. And this is in like your standard FEMA class, ICS class. It basically shows the incident commander, the command staff, and then you'll see the general staff here. Now, most of you who are frontline EMS providers are going to be nestled somewhere in the operations section, usually under a medical branch or EMS branch, and that's where most of you are going to sit. Unless the incident is really huge, you might not need a lot of these sections, a lot of these other sections. So for most of you, especially at the Pro B level, you're going to end up somewhere in the operations section, and so that's what I want you to pay most attention to. Just to run through each of the roles there. So the incident commander is going to establish the objectives and decide what do we need to get done during this thing. An important concept is that of unified command. So if there are multiple agencies involved, like police, fire, EMS, there's a leader from each one who are together to help ensure that we're accomplishing shared objectives. It also helps us order resources together and integrate operations. So unified command may take the place of the incident commander there if it's a large enough incident and multiple agencies are involved. Now the command staff, each of these roles has a job description that kind of sounds like what the name is. The most important of these for you guys to understand is the safety officer. There always needs to be a safety officer who's checking for any safety issues that may be hazardous to incident personnel. Now, on the general staff, most of you are going to, like I said, fall somewhere in the operations section, operating under the operations section chief, and you're going to be doing what you do best, saving lives. Okay? That's where most of you are going to fall in this structure here. Now, we talked about span of control a little bit before. I'm going to say it again. The ideal ratio is 1 to 5 with an upper limit of 7. Okay? 1 to 5, upper limit of 7. Now, how do you maintain span of control? So you maintain span of control by dividing things. So in the operation section, most of you are going to be involved in the medical branch, sometimes called the EMS branch. And then there is a branch director who leads this, and there's a section chief who leads this. Now, in a small incident, they might be one and the same, but in a larger incident, it'll probably be 2 different people. And then you can divide the branch further into divisions based on geography or groups based on functionality. And I think my video might be covering this a little bit, but all it says is groups, okay? And groups are based on functionality. Now, groups could be divided even further, and so can divisions, actually. So what you could divide your group in is into single resource, so like a 1 EMT, or sometimes single resource could refer to one particular piece of equipment or vehicle. You could also have a strike team, which is multiple of the same resource, such as 3 EMTs, or more commonly a task force, where you have a mix of different resources, such as EMTs and paramedics. Now, I mentioned before the term EOC. The EOC, remember, is offsite, okay? ICS is for on-scene. Okay. EOCs are often organized with an ICS-like structure, so there's a lot of similarity, but just remember ICS is for the on-scene management, the EOC is off-site, and it can provide coordinated support. Okay, so we talked a lot about theory, we talked some about history. Let's talk about a real-world example of this to really try to help you guys understand how this works. So I'm going to tell you about Operation Poison Milk. This is a case I had while I was a fellow over at Cooper. And I'm going to take some artistic liberty here. I'm not going to tell you the incident exactly how it happened. I'm going to modify it a little bit just to illustrate certain points of incident command here. But it should be a good teaching example for us and gives us the basis for something to look at. And just so you know, this was all public knowledge. This was all over the news, this incident. And you can actually see circled here, that's my doctor card there when I responded to the incident. So, you know, this is a real world thing that happened. And so hopefully that brings it home for you a little bit, how important this is to real world stuff. So it all started out with a milk carton. It looked like pretty normal milk carton, except when we opened it up and poured it out, this is what was in there. Obviously, that's not milk. That was a clear liquid that had a vinegary odor. And to make the long story short, it was discovered that that liquid was believed to be a cleaner that was used to clean the milk lines, and that accidentally got into the milk. And so what happened was we were dispatched to schools where the milk had been distributed. So initially at the first site, this was a school for developmentally delayed kids, so many of them also didn't understand what milk was supposed to be and drank that anyway. Some of them took a little sip, said it was yucky. Some drank the whole thing. Some actually drank even 2 of those. And at this site, kids started to get sick. They started to get nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea. And in total, there were 33 patients there. All were pediatric except for one. One teacher also put that in their coffee and drank it. At site 2, we also had a bunch of kids drink the milk. This time the milk wasn't as clear. It was a little more milky colored, so it wasn't as obviously tainted. But 92 kids drank some amount of this here, and some of them started to get sick. So now we've got 33 plus 92, plus another 2 patients at a third site. So when you roll up on one of these situations, and now you've got 3 sites involved, you've got a huge number of patients, it's easy to get overwhelmed. And so what I encourage you in these situations is to start to keep it simple, go back to the basics, go back to basic ICS and NIMS. So initially what happened was police, fire, and EMS and hazmat get dispatched. Unified command, remember I just said unified command, if there's a lot of groups involved, is used to bring together leaders from different agencies to determine the objectives for the incident. Okay? Now, what was one of the objectives? Well, one of the objectives on this incident was to create a field hospital. Now, why did we need a field hospital? Well, there were a large amount of casualties from this incident, right? We just saw how many sites are involved and how many kids are involved. Imagine trying to take all those kids and dumping them into the local ERs. That's going to overwhelm the system. So one of the objectives was to create a field hospital to try to clear some patients from the scene who are not that sick and offload the local hospitals. So to accomplish the objective, there was an operations section chief, and underneath the operations section chief, there was a medical branch director established, and the medical branch got divided into divisions based on the geography at each school. And then within each division, task forces of docs, so myself and actually 4 other EMS physicians were part of this, paramedics and EMTs were established. So we had clinical task forces to provide care. And each of these had a sub-leader to allow the span of control to be maintained. So the operations section chief supervises the branch directors, of one of which is the medical branch. Within the medical branch, you had 3 divisions. So the medical branch director has 3 divisions to keep track of. And then within the divisions, you have your task forces. So no one has too many things to keep track of. Span of control, no more than 1 to 5 was maintained. Okay? It can go up to 7, but in this case we stick to the ideal, 1 to 5. Now, in this particular incident, because it was able to be wrapped up in the span of a couple hours, we didn't really need some of these other sections, and so we didn't use them. ICS and NIMS are scalable and modular, so you don't have to use everything. You use what you need for a given incident. Okay? So in this particular incident, we didn't really use this. Now, what would happen, let's say the incident got worse. Let's say instead of getting better, it got worse or became more prolonged. You could expand by adding more divisions, groups, and task forces, and you just need to maintain span of control. The other thing to remember as an incident becomes prolonged, there's going to have to be a shift change, and you're going to have to transfer command to the next shift. Okay? And then the operation will continue until the incident objectives are achieved and demobilization is initiated. So let's summarize it there. So NIMS, or the National Incident Management System, it's a nationwide, comprehensive approach to incident management. ICS is nestled within the command and control element of NIMS. You expand or contract the roles in that ICS tree as the incident grows and contracts. You just have to remember to keep appropriate span of control. Again, that's 1 to 5, no more than 1 to 7. The other key thing is use plain language. We don't want any confusion when you talk, okay? So take a moment, go back, look at some of those charts, take the online ICS and FEMA classes, ICS 100, NIMS 700, and get a little bit more familiar with it and start to practice at the events like the fireworks and 4th of July. So these are the links to the training. You can also just Google these and find it pretty easily. It's for free. If you haven't done it already, you should do so. If some of you were interested in some of the history, this document from FEMA is where I got some of that historical information from about the development of ICS and NIMS. I think that's going to wrap it up for this time. I'll see you guys on the next one.